So it's too bad we didn't have more time to talk about
Acho que a gente pode começar, né? Olá, boa noite, boa noite a todas e a todos. Eu vou começar a falar em português, depois eu falo em inglês, tá, para apresentá-la. Imagino que todas e todos aqui já tenham os equipamentos. Vocês sabem que as conferências têm tradução simultânea, então se vocês preferirem, vocês podem usar o equipamento, tudo bem? Tá, então vamos começar, gente. Eu vou fazer a apresentação em inglês. So, today we have Professor Michèle Lamont. She's a professor of sociology and of African and African American studies at Harvard University. She grew up in Quebec and she studied political theory at the University of, how do you say that in English? Ottawa. Before obtaining a doctorate in sociology at the University of Paris in 1983. Michèle Lamont is a cultural sociologist who studies morality, group boundaries, and inequality. She has tackled topics such as dignity, respect, stigma, racism, and how we evaluate social worth across societies in books such as Money, Morals, and Manners, the Dignity of Working Men, How Professors Think, and the co-authored Getting Respect, Responding to Stigma and Discrimination in the US, Brazil, and Israel. Her most recent book is Seeing Others, How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. It was published in 2023, right? She's also the author of several collective works and over 100 articles published in American Sociological Review, American Journal of Sociology, Annual Review of Sociology, Human Nature, Behavior, and other prominent outlets. She served as the 108th president of the American Sociological Association from 2016 through 2017. She's an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, the American Philosophical Society, the Royal Society of Canada, and the British Academy. So, without further ado, I would like you all to welcome Professor Lamont. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for this introduction. Very nice to be here in Sao Paulo. As I said yesterday in another session, it's my first time here. I'm really enjoying discovering the place. I spent quite a bit of time in Rio de Janeiro. I know it's a much worse city than Sao Paulo, but it's a joke. Yeah, because of this book, that Getting Respect, that Edison just mentioned. But anyway, I'm really grateful to have been invited here. I've learned a lot about Brazilian sociology in the little time that I've been here. So I'm sorry to be speaking to you in English, of course. I'd prefer to talk to you in your own language, but being French-Canadian, I'm particularly sensitive to the domination of the English, so I sympathize with you. So what is this talk about? Well, it's really a talk that it comes out, I'm going to talk to you about this book, Getting Respect, Seeing Others, which came out in September of 2023, but also the work that I've been doing this year. I've been on sabbatical year. I call it my traveling sabbatical. I spend 5 months in Amsterdam, then 1 month in Hong Kong, 3 months in Manchester, UK, and then a month in Paris, developing the project that I'm going to talk to you about that really grew out of the book Seeing Others, as a way to think about what are the paths through which various groups can seek recognition, what paths are closed and what paths are open in different contexts. But first, I want to set the problematique, the set of questions that I'm asking in the context of the book Seeing Others. And I decided to write Seeing Others during the first Trump presidency. And as like many people, I was a little depressed at the time. So I had these friends, Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt, who wrote a book titled How Democracy Dies, that became very influential in giving Americans the tools they needed to understand what was happening in American politics during the first Trump presidency. And I felt very much as Trump was from the very beginning, as soon as he was elected, he did the travel ban against Muslim countries. He started attacking trans. And as a cultural sociologist, I'm, of course, very attuned to the literature on stigmatization and recognition. And I felt, okay, we have the tool, sociologists have the tool to understand what's happening here. But a lot of people, all they're experiencing is the slaps in the face and the feeling of being, rejected, and the nastiness and the lack of human decency that was behind a lot of what he was doing. But I felt people need the analytical tools also. So I decided to write this book, which frankly is a book for a trade audience. It's my first book for a trade audience, where I try to spell out for people what is recognition. How can people create a more inclusive world through mobilizing cultural repertoires that are more inclusive? And that was very much in line with my, research agenda all along. For 40 years, I've been working on how to make group boundaries more permeable, more flexible. So you will see how this connects with this agenda. But the background is, of course, also we can think of between 2010 and 2023, explosions of movements that are doing recognition claims. So that happens at the left and the right of the political spectrum, right? We have Black Lives Matter, Me Too. In Europe, you have the same things. You have movements for the rights of Muslims as well. But this movement happens at the left and the right of the political spectrum. You have Make America Great Again, with downwardly mobile working class men who are asking for respect by embracing nationalism, making more salient their identity as American, an identity that they view as being highly valued. But you have the farmers in the Netherlands and everywhere in Europe who are revolting against the EU because the EU has passed a number of policies that only advantage the middle class. So, for instance, subsidies to electric cars, which does absolutely nothing for them because they cannot afford electric cars. So I really am interested in how these recognition claims function at both ends of the political spectrum, and also, frankly, in making more aware the progressive and liberal end of the political spectrum, that working class people also want their dignity to be respected. And this is so crucial. We know now, there are studies in a recent book by Anderson and anyway, it's called the Science of Dignity, that demonstrate that subjective well-being is very much dependent on having their people's dignity recognized. So the history of the social sciences is based on a materialist assumption. But now we know that for mental health and many other things, to be treated in a way where your dignity is not acknowledged is equally damageable to our well-being. So this is the cover of the book. It came out in the US and the UK simultaneously. The white cover is the American cover. They totally screwed up with the title because the subtitle, How It Can Heal a Divided World, is a subtitle that they wanted to add because they wanted the book to be sold on Amazon in the self-help section, which frankly I didn't care about. But the design is very appropriate because the big black circle is the circle of who belongs, and you have smaller circles of different colors and different sizes that want to be in the center. So the puzzle is really, how can we broaden this circle and how to redefine worth in a divided world? That's the British version published by Penguin. The cover is very boring, but the title at least is okay. So, and seeing others, all of you who are attuned to Gen Z culture, you know how important this question of being able to live your life authentically is at the center of Gen Z culture, and it's a topic to which I'm going to be returning in a few minutes. So as I was a little depressed and thinking about how to imagine an alternative world, of course, I turned to the social science literature on the topic. And there's a wonderful, very lively literature developing around precisely how people are imagining futures. And that literature has a lot to do with repertoires, cultural repertoires, stories that we create about, and that allow us to imagine alternative at a time when the American dream is not delivering anymore. For millennials and Gen Zs, this just seems as total blah, blah, because no one can afford a house. So the idea that we realize ourselves as American through individualism and the pursuit of consumption, that's over for people who are, younger than 50. So in this context, how are people imagining their life moving forward? So I turn to many people who are what I call professional change agents, people whose job it is to create new narratives. And we also turn to ordinary people. In this book, ordinary people are Gen Zs, young people born after 1997, who were, when we interviewed them in college, both in the Midwest and the Northeast. And we ask people questions about, what they perceive as a challenge today, if they are professional change agents, what kind of new narratives about the world they're trying to create. And we found very quickly that for these change agents, really, inclusion and authenticity was absolutely at the center of what they were doing. And one example of this is the person with the white T-shirt, Zachary Drucker, who was an advisor on the show Transparent, the trans person. And when I interviewed Joy Soloway, who is the creator of this show, it's a show that became enormously popular during the pandemic because I don't know if it exists here, if it was translated and available in Brazil, but it's really about the life of a woman, advanced middle-aged woman who becomes trans, or it's, that's her identity, and she is negotiating this identity with her adult children. And when I interviewed the creator of the show, they said, well, my goal is just to make trans people less abhorrent, more understandable. And those words were really repeated time and time again by a lot of people we interviewed. Provide depiction of groups that are marginalized, that are less unidimensional, to depict them in a way that is more humane, more in line with how they want to be seen. So this T-shirt, I see you always and always, kind of expresses this desire for people to live authentically and to be understood. And a lot of this is viewed as woke culture, right? And woke culture has pissed off a lot of people, but at the same time, for many Gen Zs and millennials, this is, you have to live your best life today because there's no other alternative. And this desire to put inclusion and authenticity at the center of their life is crucial, in part because truly there's no American dream anymore. Truly organizing your life around upward mobility makes no sense. And they get very angry if that is not recognized. So the other T-shirt became a poster that you found for several years and still today on many, many people's lawns. Posters on people's house, placard on their lawns that proclaims, in some ways, what I call ordinary universalism. How people who are not college educated, how people who have not read the Rousseau or the Enlightenment think about universalism, which is really to emphasize what we all share as human beings. I have a paper on this called Ordinary Cosmopolitanism. The slogan, Love is Love, was at the center of the same-sex marriage campaign. No Woman is Illegal was at the center of the campaign in support of undocumented immigrants in the US. Kindness is Everything. This emphasis on empathy was very much, at the center of many people, like a positive psychology agenda. I'm not a fan of this. I don't think empathy is a solution. You will see, I'm a cultural sociologist. The argument is very much about how are we creating an environment where repertoires of inclusion are much more readily available. So it's not about nudging individuals and telling them to do yoga or mindfulness. It's really about creating a supply side of cultural repertoires that is one of several strategies that I think we can use to move toward a more inclusive society, and one where group boundaries are more flexible. So the theoretical approach behind this is explained in this book. which came out in 2013. For 19 years, I was co-directing a research group funded by a Canadian foundation titled Successful Societies. And we ask ourselves, under what conditions can we foster, contexts where people can be all they can be? That's a joke also, because it's the slogan of the American Army that they use to recruit people. But the goal is really, what are the scaffolding that can be made available to people? And the scaffolding that we focus in this book are both institutions. The collaborators were sociologists, political scientists, legal scholars. So institutions such as, let's say, same-sex marriage. As same-sex marriage came to be adopted in a large number of states in the US, you saw a rapid decline in attempted suicide among LGBTQ youth. So these laws were not created to foster the well-being of LGBTQ youth, but it had this as an unintended consequence. Precisely because these laws were giving the message, you have access to one of the most sacred institution of our society, marriage. So, and you have, these institutions and cultural repertoires provide messages all the time. It's kind of an unintended effect, an unintended consequence of us interacting with each other every day. And we can more purposefully create such narratives that are supporting. So a lot of the book is to explain what are narratives about, and how do they work, and how can we use narratives to create a more inclusive society. So the book, in the third chapter, I think, as the first two chapters are the most depressing chapters ever, because they are about the current context, the decline of the American dream, what it does to the bottom half of the society, with death by despair, the enormous mental health crisis that American society is encountering now, but also the consequence on the upper middle class that are also terrible. Because a lot of kids are suffering from being raised in greenhouse effect, where they feel very much that they have to compete for everything all the time, and it's very pernicious. And the quality of life of the upper middle class is not that great, because consumption, the treadmill of consumption doesn't give a satisfaction on the long term. So the parallel, so this concept of recognition, you've encountered it. Oh, I'm sorry about this. I'm screwing up. It's not going as I want. It's not moving the way I want. Okay. I'm sorry about this. Okay. So Axel Honneth, I'm sure you've heard about the debate between Honneth and Nancy Fraser, the politics of distribution and recognition. Very much battling, which one is most important, giving people things or telling them they're wonderful. To me, this is a case of a question mal posée, as we say in French, a badly asked question, because, of course, the distribution of resources has a recognition impact and vice versa. So, but the key in this definition is that it's a social act. All of us sociologists were familiar with the W.I. Thomas theorem. What is defined as true is defined in its consequence. We define, reality in interaction with each other. So recognition is something I can certainly proclaim for myself, but it's much more powerful when it is confirmed by others. And that's happening throughout as we lead our life on a daily basis. And the counterpart is stigmatization. We all know about this through Goffman. And the two of them together are constantly in interaction to create shared definition of cultural membership, which goes hand in hand with the shared understanding that we have about who owes what to whom. Do we owe support to low-income people? Who's deserving of support? And the background there is really a theory of social identity that, many sociologists and psychologists have written about this. One version that I like is the work of Richard Jenkins, which distinguishes between self-identification and group categorization. So I'm French-Canadian. There's a definition that French Canadians share collectively about who we are. English Canadians historically had a very stigmatized understanding of who we were. As I was growing up during the 60s and 70s, there was a very deep cultural revolution, which was a transformation, a collective work to transform this shared definition of who Québécois were, which was one, a huge moment of cultural explosion, expression across all the performing arts. There were a very famous book written, White N-Word of America, to denounce the fact that the Québécois were viewed as cheap labor, on and on and on. Another book called Speak White. Speak White meant something that English Canadian would tell Québécois, speak English, please. So it was really a movement of, collective, prise de conscience, self-awareness of this stigmatization and contestation, which happened at the same time as the Black Power movement, and which happened also at different temporality in various groups around the world. The decolonization movement, I could go on and on. So the point is that it's collective achievement, and that the boundaries between groups can be changed. You have people now, such as Jonathan Haidt, who writes about tribalism. We are told by many cognitive psychologists that we are all wired. I hate that word because it has to do with human nature. To like people who are like ourselves and dislike people who are not like ourselves. Well, the alternative to this in a sociological language is really to try to understand better how boundaries can be made more porous. And they are being made porous all the time. Of course, it's not linear. We're not into modernization theory here. There's a lot of back and forth, 1 step forward, 3 steps backwards. There's no doubt that today with Trump, in Bolsonaro, we're in the five step backward. But on the other hand, these things are dynamic and can change. So since here we are among peers in the public of sociologists, I'm just going to say a few words about the meta theory that's behind all of this. In a paper titled What is Missing, we describe the various approach to inequality. And at the top in the type 1 process is what we teach when we teach, intro to inequality to our undergrads. Marx, Weber, exploitation, closure, domination. The book by Charles Steele, Durable Inequality, captures a lot of that. Type 2 processes, that's largely what happened in the 80s as Bourdieu's work became widely diffused, including in the US. It really had a very, very profound impact on American sociology and transformed the agenda in several subfields. The kind of process that I'm studying are much less understood, and they are described here under type 3 processes. It includes identification, racialization, all these Asian concepts, but they all have to do with their cultural processes. And they have to do with meaning making, and they often have to do with morality and the construction of groups. And there's a lot of parallels between all these processes, and this paper summarizes some of this work. So we can now think about inequality instead of opposing, Marxists to, I don't know, ecologists. Instead, we can think about processes feeding into inequality as really multi-causal and complementary to each other. And it's a big, umbrella in which we can all, develop theories that may be viewed sometimes as incompatible with each other, but that often can be very much compatible. So that's what I'm trying to do. That's how I understand the work that I'm doing in relation to it. And this is here, I'm just showing you this book because I think it's a book that as many Brazilian sociologists don't know about, but it's a book on which I worked for 8 years, and it includes 2 of the co-authors are Brazilian, Elisa Reich and Graziela Moraes Silva, who was one of my graduate students at Harvard, who's now at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. But we're comparing in this book Black people in the US, Brazil, and Israel. In Israel, we have Ethiopian Jews. And we have also the 2 other groups in Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the most dominated group there, and Mizrahim, who are at the bottom of the labor market, but they are Jewish, so they think they belong. So we document how they have experienced racism, no, not racism, what we call assault on the self. Have you ever been treated unfairly? How did it happen? Describe to me what you did. Describe to me what happened. So we distinguish between stigmatization and discrimination, and then we document the repertoire of responses. In the US, African Americans respond and confront without hesitation, whereas in Israel, in the Brazil context, there's much more hesitation because our respondents, there's over 100 respondents in each of the national sites, they say, well, I'm not sure if it was because of race or because they think I'm poor. So we really look at the role of cultural repertoire and institution context and a lot of other factors in feeding the various types of response and experiences that we're able to document in the book. So I thought I'd just say a few words about this to make you aware of the book in case you've never, it's not been translated in Brazilian, in Portuguese. I really like it to be, but anyway, it exists, just so you know. So now to get into the study itself, so what we did is it's really a study of the production and diffusion. We're not looking at the consumption of cultural repertoires, but we were able, it was the pandemic and no one had anything to do. Everyone was at home. It was a wonderful time to conduct interviews online on Zoom. So we reached out to 185 interviewees who were, most of them, very, very influential change agents, people specializing in the production of repertoires. And that includes 75 interviews with stand-up comics and Hollywood creative. If you follow American TV, you would recognize many of them. And these 80 interviews with college students. And the way the research design was really to think about a number of organizational fields where the production of narratives is very central to the work that people are doing. Academia should be there as well. And from that, we use networks and we, mobilize, we use snowball sampling, of course. And we wrote letters, for instance, to the Hollywood creative, this and that person has agreed to be interviewed by us. Do you want to be interviewed too? And we reached out to their agents and a lot of them said that yes, because they had nothing else to do. The timing was really good. So we have like 9 slides like this that describe some of the people we've interviewed, but just a few very influential people. Mike Schur, who created Park and Recreation and The Good Life. I don't know what is on TV here, so I don't know how much of those names are familiar to you. But just one example, Channing Donghae, when I interviewed her, she was vice president of Netflix, and it was her job to define what was diffused at the global level. So she's the one who decided to diffuse Black Panther in Africa and in India. And she said, when I interviewed her, she said, it's very important for me as a Black woman that this story of Black Panther be made available to little kids who are brown and Black so that they can get a depiction of Black people that is glorious, not one where they're victim, where they're beaten down, where they're really a kind of, very... And Jack Conte created Patreon, it's a platform that was extremely important because it gave artists, musicians, a capacity to be directly supported by their fans instead of, depending on radio. So it really was a tool of, decentralization of cultural diffusion. That was very important. So the book, the penultimate chapter is a kind of, for the reader, what can you, ordinary middle-class, American middle-class, because we presume like people who will buy and read this book are people who are used to reading nonfiction. What can you do to help transport the world, and how is it happening? How can we create boundaries that are more flexible? So the book details 3 approaches. I'm going to talk you quickly about the first, and then I'll barely flag the other 2 because I want to get to the current project. So the first is really for us to move from a unidimensional definition of who's worthy, which is largely in line with the neoliberal scripts of self that we're all familiar with, and then celebration of ordinary universalism, and there's a chapter on Gen Zs that's all about this, and the process of stigma reduction, which I'll talk about briefly. So this neoliberal scripts of self, in some ways we can see it incarnated by Trump. It's all about, socioeconomic success. The people who are great are the people who make money, who are competitive. So there's really a Darwinist spirit, and who celebrate meritocracy. You'll tell me Trump doesn't, but, his attack on DEI is all about saying like people who get to the top should be the people who don't have special advantages. And the problem with meritocracy, of course, we all know it's an ideology, and we all know that it is presuming that we start on an even playing field, but we're not. My kids have 2 parents who have PhDs, so they will probably screw up at some point in life, but it will be harder for them to screw up than for other kids. So, in self-reliance, it's all, of course, about, standing, pulling ourselves by our breeches. So it's so extremely highly institutionalized in the US. It's a script that is embraced by 95% of Americans, and it's embraced in a great many countries. There's a study by Jonathan Maish that shows it has increased in popularity enormously from 1930 until today. And except for 3 countries in this paper that came out in Sociological Forum, which are Canada, France, and Austria, bizarrely enough. He looks at all the advanced industrial societies. The problem with this is that it creates a very strong, it's a caste system that separates those who have a college degree, people in this room, or even in this case, PhDs, and people who don't. And, the death by despair argument by Adcase and Angus Deaton demonstrates, what the impact of growing inequality since the 1980s, with the apex of neoliberalism, has had on people, on well-being. And we know that working class people, through the media, for instance, in the American context, it's increasingly rare that they are now exposed to, shows that give them a positive understanding of who workers are. The vast majority of the characters in all entertainment television are professionals and managers. And when you have a worker, as in, for instance, Bart Simpson, he's a total idiot, someone that no one would want to emulate. So many people have written that, the diploma divide increasingly works as a caste divide in the American context and in many other advanced societies. So this is a system, I think, that is not, cannot perdure. And we find ourselves with this current Trump moment and the success of the radical right across so many advanced industrial societies that I think really demonstrate to us that we really need to think other different ways about how these scripts of self, of who's worthy, need to be changed. And one solution is try to move us away toward multiple definitions of self, of a valuable self, and how can they become more widely spread. So our study of a stand-up comic, one of the papers that came out does a very detailed analysis of what they tell us in their interviews about what they're doing in their work. So the vast majority of them are engaged in work that we describe as, recognition work. They say, I'm not paid to give people lessons and to tell them to eat their vegetables. I'm paid to make people laugh, but while I'm making people laugh, it's really important for me that I laugh at racist people, or that I make fun of, old farts who are, sexist or whatever. So it's very much embedded. The language they use to describe their work and what gives meaning to them when they do their work is very much about recognition. So that's the Trojan horse strategy, is precisely that. You plant, anti-racist jokes in your work. So this is just to give you a very, one example of what the book does when it comes to, in some ways, trying to unsettle a neoliberal scripts of self to say that many kinds of people are valuable and we should not just, drink the Kool-Aid of the American dream. And so another example was, if you go on YouTube and you type question bridge, you will see this video by an artist who interviewed for this video 150 Black men. And he asked them, what does it mean? How is it today to be a Black man in the US? And of all these people, he finds an enormous amount of diversity. And he says the only thing we find that they have in common is that they all share the experience of microaggression on a daily basis. So this guy's name is Hank Willis Thomas. And the reason I'm giving you this example is that he created an association with an organization called the Campaign for Black Male Achievement, which the director of this organization, their agenda is to transform the narrative about Black men from one that Black men is a problem to one where Black men are a source of achievement and transformation of society. And they took this video and they showed it to over 2,000 organizations across, both community centers and high schools across the US. to really create discussion and debates about the experience of Black men in the US. So it became like a massive societal experiment. And that's one of many other examples, with the goal very explicitly to challenge the dominant narratives about Black men. And because of this kind of collaboration, the book proposes this concept of recognition chain, which is really connecting the cultural producers who are producing these new narratives with the funders, the philanthropists, who often scale up and fund Black Lives Matter, fund all kinds of organizations. One example, that one organization that has been a leading force in this is the Ford Foundation. They're not perfect, but since 2013, the leader, Darren Walker, decided we're going to fight inequality, and we're going to do this through 4 pillars. And one of those 4 pillars is changing hearts and minds, which means using narratives to fight inequality. And that was quite novel at the time because, of course, Ford, like many other foundations, were just giving money to economists to do experiments such as, moving to opportunities. So they decided to use their funding to really create social change. And that kind of change spread like fire after Black Lives Matter. There was elite replacement in many, many of the top philanthropies in the US, the Mellon Foundation, and now there's a huge, huge backlash, as you would imagine. So the second approach, very briefly, is what I call reduction of stigma, drawing on the study we did of how very quickly the stigma against people who have HIV/AIDS, which was extremely strong. When I arrived in the US in 1983, I was at Stanford, the middle of, the AIDS crisis, San Francisco, people were dying left and right. Everyone was very scared of people with HIV/AIDS, just as with the beginning of COVID, because we're not sure how it diffused. But there was very much the view that it was the disease of gay men who were having sex in public bathrooms. So moral boundaries were really central to the stigmatization of this group. But then over time, there was many knowledge producers, journalists, social scientists, medical experts, legal experts, who produced alternative knowledge that really challenged this moral stigmatization of AIDS and transformed it to the point where today the stigma against people with AIDS has really declined drastically. But this did not happen for other groups like obesity. Here we draw on secondary studies, a book by Abigail Sagi titled What's Wrong with Fat, which shows how the medical associations in the US really oppose the destigmatization of obesity in many, many ways by opposing a movement called Healthy at Any Weight. I don't have time to describe it to you, but this is the pathways that we extracted from in-depth studies of groups that have remained stigmatized and groups that have become destigmatized to try to understand how it happens. And we show that these this is for those of you social scientists who are depressed about what we're doing, well, we are constantly producing knowledge that is being mobilized by social movements and other groups to transform the collective definition we have of groups by drawing on cultural resources. So it's also a structural process that involves culture. So it's a cultural process involving resources. This, when I feel depressed, that makes me happy. So, and the final part I want to talk to you briefly is about what the Gen Zs are doing. So certainly, a lot of ink has been spilled on woke culture and Gen Zs. And what we found when we did our, first, I didn't do this interview myself. My graduate student did because I'm way too old and they don't like to talk with boomers. So that would not have gone very well. But what we know is that we wrote this one paper that shows how what they're doing is really braiding different repertoires. They're not embracing the traditional American dream anymore, but they are American kids who think that being agentic is very important. You have to take your life in your hands, but they're doing things that my generation never did. Talk about the therapeutic ethos, the importance of the work-life balance. When I was 24, I didn't know that existed. And this ordinary universalism, the idea that you live your best life today, because, you don't know what's ahead, but you should also treat other people decently. So, at the American context, at least, there's zero tolerance among young people about, 30-year-old men who go out with 18-year-old girls, whereas when I was a young person, that was everywhere, So they really have a notion about what's acceptable in terms of equal relationship that is really, really deep. I have Gen Zs, I have 3 of them, so I know very well what are the things that they like and don't like. So it's really a transformation. That's at the bottom up, and we have interviews in our interviews. Who do they read? Who do they admire? Greta Thunberg is number 1. Bernie Sanders is number 2, But okay, these are college students, okay? So not every Gen Z is progressive. We'll get to this in a second. Those who are in college. Of all the people we interviewed, the majority of them were progressive and liberal. A few were conservative. But we did these interviews in the fall of 2019 and during Black Lives Matter, okay? What happens 5 years later is quite different. So at the end of the day, the end of the story of the book is that this constant production of narratives produces a lot of babies. The 100,000 points of light are creating social change, which result in posters such as this one, which we also found on many, many lawns in the US during the pandemic, celebrating ordinary universalism. And I think that this production is still continuing today. Many of us who have spent, years working in an organization where there was a lot of diversity, serving on committees, making decisions about admissions and all kinds of things where diversity criteria were factored in. We're not, schizophrenic. We're not forgetting tomorrow what people have been committed to for many years. So even if there's huge pushback from against DEI from, the Trump government and some of his allies, I don't think the social change we know, many, many people oppose is anti-immigrant policy. There's a lot of, although he claims to have a national mandate to do everything he's doing, is not. He doesn't. And many people are continuing to support him, in part because the Democratic Party is dead. They don't offer an alternative, and people need hope. And no one else is giving them narratives of hope right now. So I think if there were alternative, fewer people than 30% would support him. But anyway, so the story I just told you is pre-Trump, right? But pre-Trump 2.0, unfortunately, I didn't know that would be a second term. Neither did you, I'm sure. So, but since then, he's been systematically attacking all the kinds of people that were interviewed for my book. 3 days ago, the Supreme Court gave him the right to abolish the Ministry of Education. And the Minister of Education, the head of this department right now, is a woman who was the head of the mixed martial art competition. She has nothing to do with education. It's like totally absurd. But this is just for a month or so I was following what he was doing. His attack against universities, his attack against the arts, the public radio station, and on and on. It's not worth spending much time on this. I'm sure that you're all aware of the craziness that's going on. And I've published a paper that examines the response, the counterattack. And there's a lot of resistance at the ground level. So for instance, he's abolished funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities across all the red state where, people are living in the cultural no man's land. So, but there are recognition chains that are happening there too with resistance. Of course, we would all like to have more resistance, but it's taking place. So let's change gear now to talk about the project that I'm doing now. Being on leave all year, I decided to focus precisely on the young workers who don't have a college degree. And I decided to focus, it's a collaborative project where we're comparing Manchester, New Hampshire, which is an hour north of Boston, and Manchester, UK. Both places were the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution in the US and the UK. And we chose these places in part because there's a very long tradition of working class struggle there and strikes, important strikes. And so we're focusing on young workers, 18 to 30. And we interviewed them in Manchester, New Hampshire, between May and December of 2024, so during the election. And we're trying to understand whether and how they can gain recognition through politics. And then we're looking at, someone came out of the woodwork, a postdoc from Finland, who said, I'm from Tampere, Finland. It's the Manchester of Finland. Can I join your project? And we said yes, in part because there's still a safety net in Finland. And we thought it would be really interesting to compare the neoliberal countries that are US and UK with the case of Finland. And then there's other, so the project, it's the least conventional, like I'm really into comparative case studies now, in part because it's the least reductivist approach to doing social sciences that you can take. It's the old comprehensive method of Weber that is certainly out of favor now in political science and economics, but I think still trying to understand the comprehensive approach remains, the Verstian approach remains absolutely crucial to me. So there are several case studies that I'm going to talk to you about quickly now. So Manchester, New Hampshire, that's what it looks like. And we ask ourselves, okay, they're politically alienated. We don't know. We're going to see how do they connect their class identity with place identity, given that the place where they live have such a history of working class mobilization. And you can see all the red brick buildings there in Manchester, New Hampshire. And you have exactly the same in Manchester, UK. And in both places, workers, non-college educated workers have been courted by the radical right. So we want to see how do they react to this. And there's a very large literature comparing American workers and UK workers, you know, the Seymour Martin Lipset's work on American exceptionalism. It goes on and on and on. But so much has changed with the working class since with the decline of unions and many other things. The polarization left right has become very confusing for many people in the US because it totally loses its meaning. So it's an opportunity really to ask questions about how workers are thinking about their positioning right now. So we did these interviews with 45 randomly sampled workers in Manchester, New Hampshire, men and women, and we find that basically they associate politics. We ask them, what are the words you associate with politics? And it's all, terrible. It's drama, it's toxic, I don't want to talk about this, it creates rifts in the family, moral boundaries, because it's all corruption from people above. They want to stay away from it. So we argue, and we find in our interviews that they draw very strong boundaries toward people below, toward the renters, the drug addicts. There's a lot of drug addicts in Manchester. It's a place where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. You don't buy 2 Starbucks coffee with that. And it's been the same since 2015. So 30% of our interviewees have to have 2 jobs to not become homeless. So it's really hard. They like people above. They admire someone like Trump, but not Nepo babies. They think people have to work hard to succeed. And they still these people embrace the American dream, but we think they embrace it because it's the emblem of symbolic citizenship. If you don't say you like the American dream in the US, you're viewed as a slacker. So, and when we ask them, do you define yourself as working class? They say, what is working class? Yeah, I work hard, I'm a worker. So these concepts of class are simply not readily available to them. And we ask them, do you belong to a union? Very few of them know what a union is. So it's really the case where the disintegration of all working class institutions is now proceeding for these young people who anyway don't know anything about history. History is barely taught in school, they don't know about what's left, what's right. It's all very confusing in their mind. And they have no knowledge about the history of workers, the history of Manchester. So total disconnection between place identity and class identity. And they're not nostalgic about the position of workers in American society because they don't know much about it. So we have a paper that shows that there's 4 paths through which they get recognition. They find recognition through politics. One is by supporting Trump. 13 of our respondents do this, and they love Trump because Trump is courting them, and he's saying to them, I believe in you. I believe you are hardworking people. And things are going badly for you. It's because of immigrants, and it's because of globalization, and I'm going to address this for you. And in a condition of scarcity of resource, we're not going to give money to anyone. We keep all our money for ourselves. We don't give money to immigrants, to the poor. So a lot of the policies that he's following now are totally in line with this, except that now he's starting to like Ukraine again. So they receive recognition by him telling them, in a situation of scarcity, count on me, I'll take care of you. And you exclude everyone else as a consequence. Through inclusion, those are the few, 6 only, who supported the Democrats, and often they are for a more embracing universalist society, in part because they themselves are LGBTQI, or people of color, or women who are pro-abortion. But a very large number of them are gaining recognition by maintaining distance from politics, since they think that politics is toxic and crazy, and they want to protect themselves by staying away from it. So that's the non-voters and the low information voters that are often described in the political science literature as people who are not informed enough to vote, or in the Bourdieusian literature as they self-exclude because they don't feel legitimate. In fact, we're arguing that many of them do this for recognition purpose. They feel like it allows them to preserve their dignity to stay away from this madness, which I kind of agree with at some level. And recognition by elevation, they think parties are all BS and they want to be independent and make up their own mind. So the point of this paper is very much to shed a different light on the political behavior of these people who are not college-educated, and, bring more complexity to how we understand what they do. So what we're working on now is extending the getting respect analysis of groupness to try to use this to make sense of what's happening. The UK interviews have not been analyzed yet. They are just being completed now. And we're finishing the first paper by doing extra coding to really bolster our argument. The second comparative case study is a very self-indulgent study for me. I grew up in Ottawa, the black circle there. As I was growing up, there were First Nation people living 2 hours away. No one knew anything about them. It was total ignorance. And for the last 20 years, they have become much more visible and present. And you have their 4 circles showing you 4 of the 13 Algonquin First Nations living in the region. And I was able, after a lot of efforts, to get access to 2 of them, to be able to conduct interviews with members of these First Nations about whether and how they seek recognition through environmental justice and work, because there's a nuclear waste disposal site being built on their territory that could easily, pollute the whole watershed of the Ottawa River, Kishizibi in Algonquin. And this is just an enormous territory. And this nuclear waste disposal is just next to one of their sacred sites. And this is like forest up to, the very north. But they live at the end of the road, more or less. So we're doing interviews with, we're in the process of finishing them with members of those 2 First Nation. One of them supports the construction of this site because they want the jobs, and the other one opposes it because they want to define the environment. So it's really about mostly ordinary people and how they think about these issues. So alternative paths besides politics for gaining recognition. And one of my graduate students is from the Northern Mariana Island, which is 1,000 miles south of Japan, and she's indigenous, she's from there. And she's doing interviews with people there about a similar case where the American government is building, a military airfield and totally destroying their environment. So the book eventually would be one that really examine these various paths and examine also what I call the impossible paths, seeking recognition through race in France and Germany, through religion in China, through as an LGBTQ person in Senegal. So as you can see, the objective is really to continue to develop this set of questions, to develop a very systematic empirical sociology of how recognition works, which would really be a complement to the political philosophy literature. And these are my collaborators with Hilary Pilkington and Andrew Miles, who I spent 3 months at University of Manchester. They are experts of class and the radical right in Europe, and we're working on this together. And Jane and Hannah did the interviews in Manchester. So I will stop here, and I don't know if there's any time for questions, but these are people who help fund the book. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Michèle Lamont, for your brilliant presentation, brilliant conference. I believe we do have some time for three short questions.
Três perguntas breves.
Ok? A gente tem tempo para 3 perguntas, né? E depois a gente precisa encerrar. Then we have to end, to put an end to this conference. Does anybody want to ask a question? Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm coming with a microphone.
Hi, my name is Gabriela. I'm a law student from University of Estudos Europeus. I would like to ask, you talk
Can I ask it
in Portuguese.
Portuguese, if you
Ok. Você fala muito sobre o conceito de self, sobre identificação e como isso é importante, principalmente na extrema-direita. Tem um conceito também que existe sobre a instrumentalização da religião no neoliberalismo, como a religião se mistura com a política e ela perde o conceito da transcendência, o conceito da fé, ela perde a sua função original. No Brasil, algumas das instituições religiosas, onde o Estado falha de chegar, a religião ela dá um certo apoio moral para um sentido da vida, mas também um apoio social, trabalhos sociais, educação. Mas nos Estados Unidos me parece que é um pouco confuso, principalmente com a questão do Trump. Parece que tem uma nova assessora. Como que você relacionaria, por exemplo, a religião com o conceito de self e também a extrema-direita, principalmente do Trump? Porque parece uma extrema-direita diferente da Itália, por exemplo.
Anyone else?
Thanks.
Should I respond before I forget? I can do it quickly.
Okay.
There's very important books that have been written on the relationship between Christianity and Trump. It's a mix of Christian, whiteness, male, radical right, go together. The book is called The Flag and the Cross by Phil Gorski. And what's the name of the guy? Doesn't matter. Sam Perry. And it's all based on boundaries and exclusion, to protect a notion of the American nation as exceptional because Christian, and male as they are reaffirming the traditional family structure where women are supposed to be engaged in reproduction and men are supposed to be the providers. So someone like the Vice President Vance is very much of a promoter of this. So there's no surprise there. I think it's quite different than the, Paulo, for, the Latin American tradition of, using religion to support the poor. It's radically different. Maybe a difference with Catholicism.
Ok, primeiro eu queria agradecer pela palestra, foi bastante gratificante de ouvir. O que eu queria saber é que, considerando que a gente vive num sistema cuja base dele é a própria exclusão, você acha que é possível a gente construir uma sociedade de inclusão plena sem uma ruptura com o próprio sistema capitalista? Ou a ruptura com o capitalismo, uma construção de um novo sistema, uma nova materialidade seria necessária para a construção, no fim dessa construção dessa sociedade?
You're talking about Brazil?
Não, eu tô falando do mundo mesmo.
Okay.
Quer dizer, eu tô falando como um todo, mas a minha ideia é, você acha que é possível construir uma inclusão dentro do capitalismo, quando a base dele é a exclusão?
It's a great question. Good job with the question. It's a big one. I don't know. Well, okay, I'll say that. I think recognition. Yeah, okay. How would I say that? The problem is the association between recognition and the distribution of resources. So groups, I said yesterday in another session we had that recognition is not like a cake, where if I have a piece, means other people cannot have a piece. It's something we can all have at the same time. Problem is when groups start using resources that are associated with their group or the group as a way to measure who's most valuable, and then there's competition between groups who have resources, and that's partly difficult to overcome when the level of trust in society is declining rapidly, where groups will not believe that, okay, this year your group is getting what they need, next year it's our group. So the perception of zero-sum game becomes much more acute. So to the extent that capitalism is based on scarcity, right, and on monopolization of resources, yes, you're right, but there's movements like the social economy, which is extremely important. I know the cooperative economy is also quite, active in Brazil as well. In Quebec, the main banks are co-ops, and the funds that are put in the banks are used for collective development. So there's a lot of different kinds of social arrangements that can help us move in that direction. I know many people think of it as utopian, that is just a drop in the bucket, but there's a big movement that anti-consumption right now. The US, a lot of Gen Zs don't buy new clothes. They only want to have second-hand clothes. We could go on and on. I think the social economy movement is an important.
Okay. One more? Okay.
Gente, depois vai ter mais alguma pergunta?
Boa noite. Meu nome é José Vitor. Estou aqui com o Unied, orientado, né, pelo Flávio Carvalhais e Elisa Reis, lá da UFRJ. E minha pergunta mais direta, mais simples, é para perguntar qual seria a função junto do bode expiatório, dessa ideia do René Girard, e junto com as mídias sociais, para radicalizar a juventude para outro extremo, no qual, sentido contrário, no qual estava indo, que a gente viu que estava indo, agora se radicaliza para outro sentido, porque perguntando isso para os Estados Unidos, porque aqui no Brasil a gente vê uma realidade muito desse bode expiatório sendo utilizado para extrema-direita e capturando muito essa ideologia jovem, e perguntar como é que funciona a função desse bode expiatório junto com as redes sociais nos Estados Unidos. Obrigado.
Well, we know that Trump spent a lot of energy during the election cozying up to Joe Reagan, who had enormous following among young men. The whole atmosphere is about creating a culture where these isolated young men are listening to podcasts, where they feel like they're all hanging out with their bros, making jokes that are often very sexist, and they gain a feeling that they belong in the same environment. And that those shows often, a lot of what is talked about is not explicitly political, but it's a little bit, one of the analysis I'm familiar with is that they are framing what arguments that are radical right into center arguments. So they are blurring a lot of the distinction, political distinction, which just creates a lot of confusion, but they're extremely good at creating a feeling of togetherness, of intimacy, and recognition. So one of the problems is that the Democrats have not been very good at doing this. And also they are not as ready to use vulgarity, jokes like, grab her by the pussy, which is extremely popular among men who like to be shocking. Sorry, I need to. So I read yesterday that the Democrats are now starting to respond to Trump by using a lot of vulgarity. They think we have no choice, you know. If we want to regain the working class, that's what we have to do. So frankly, for me now, I'm just quite confused. But there's no doubt that the Democrats, who have been really fighting with each other and really, really powerless, that they really need to develop a strategy to be able to leverage the social media much better. This guy, Mandani, who was just following this, but the guy who's part of the Democrat Socialist Party was just chosen as the candidate for the Democrat at the primary in New York City, and that was a huge deal. And this is someone who has used very, very successful. Father is a very famous historian, so he comes from a family with very, very high, cultural capital, but he's also not at all engaging in identity politics, and it's all about housing and how to stop the housing. So we have to look closely at success stories such as his to understand what the Democratic Party. But he's a little bit like Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, very radical. So Trump is already vilifying him. He's lying. Says that Asian African doesn't exist.
Okay. I believe I have one question. If we have some time. How do we really know that narratives embracing ordinary universalism are really about reducing stigma or creating more permeable boundaries, but not the other way around? I mean, privileged groups usually use diversity and ordinariness narratives in an attempt to convince other people that they are like anybody else and that they are tolerant toward others. So maybe this narrative is about how distinction plays out in a world in which diversity is more and more valued. So it is not about universalism, but about domination and legitimation of privilege. Therefore, the construction of boundaries, of more fixed boundaries, but not permeable boundaries. I mean, how do we know it's not the other way around?
I agree with your argument, and I see where you're going. There's at least 2 or 3 books now that are focused on the upper middle class and upper class that demonstrate how they are denying their privileged. And it's true that in our interviews with the college students, they were much more really talking about inclusion concerning race, sexuality. So it's true that there's still, especially in the American context, where the language about class is quite poor. At the same time, I don't think that we can necessarily presume that this language of universalism is about the assertion of privilege or hiding one's privileges. I mean, it's true that a lot of Americans who are in the top 1%, top 10%, absolutely do not experience themselves as being so. But it doesn't mean that embracing ordinary universalism does not serve its purpose in terms of trying to create relationships that are less hard, more humane. That's why, in part, I think there's going to be enormous the erosion of DEI, the erasure of emotionally. I think we're all going to continue to do it in one or the other because it's better to give a chance to people independently. I'm optimistic.
Okay, so thank you very much again. And okay, we now have other things to do. So unfortunately, we have no more time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you liked it? not